The couple stepped into the restaurant, dressed sharp, confident, just looking for a nice meal. But the moment they walked in, something changed. The hostess barely looked at them before shaking her head. "We're fully booked. No offer to wait. No apology. Nothing." A few minutes later, another couple walked in. White, dressed no better than them. No reservation. Immediately seated. The man clenched his jaw. The woman exhaled slowly, gripping his hand. They could have argued. They could have left. But instead, the man pulled out his phone. And that single call was about to destroy everything the restaurant thought it could get away with. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. The restaurant had a warm, inviting glow, the kind that made people feel important the moment they walked in. Inside, the soft hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware against expensive plates. The staff moved with precision, dressed in crisp uniforms, offering smiles that looked rehearsed rather than genuine. Everything about the place screamed exclusivity, the kind of luxury that wasn't meant for just anyone. Outside, a sleek black car pulled up near the entrance. Elijah stepped out first, adjusting the cuff of his tailored jacket, glancing around with the calm confidence of someone used to walking into high-end places. Amira followed, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Her dress, though elegant, was simple, effortless in a way that made it clear she didn't need flashy details to prove her status. The two exchanged a quick glance, then walked toward the entrance, unaware of the storm waiting for them on the other side. As soon as they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Rachel, the hostess, a young woman with sharp eyes and a stiff posture, glanced up from her podium. Her gaze lingered on them a little too long, her expression unreadable. Then just like that, the warmth of the restaurant seemed to shrink, replaced by something colder. "Do you have a reservation?" Rachel asked, her tone clipped, businesslike. Elijah nodded. "No, but we were hoping for a table. We don't mind waiting." Rachel barely hesitated before shaking her head. "We're completely booked for the night." His brow lifted slightly. "Not even a wait list?" "No." The response was final, with no room for discussion. Amira shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against Elijah's hand. A quiet signal, a reminder to stay calm. He exhaled slowly, turning his gaze to the dining area beyond the hostess stand. The restaurant was busy, but not packed. Several tables sat empty, their white tablecloths untouched. Across the room, a waiter pulled out a chair for a couple who had just arrived. A couple that had walked in after them, without a reservation. His jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I see open tables," he said. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Those are reserved." Amira's voice was softer, but firm. "That couple didn't have a reservation. I saw them walk in right after us." Rachel barely glanced in their direction. "I believe they are regulars." It was a lie. They all knew it. But she delivered it so smoothly, so confidently, that it almost sounded reasonable. Elijah let out a slow breath, his patience thinning. "So, just to be clear, no tables, no wait list, no exceptions?" Rachel's polite smile didn't reach her eyes. "That's correct." Amira nodded, her expression unreadable. "All right, we'll just leave then." Elijah hesitated for half a second before stepping back with her. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was just disappointed. He had seen this before, felt this before. It was the same game, just a different setting. But as they turned to leave, something shifted in the air. Bryce, a waiter who had been watching the entire exchange from a few feet away, leaned toward Liam, another server, and whispered something under his breath. A chuckle followed. Elijah caught it. Amira caught it too. They had been dismissed, written off, turned into a private joke. Something in him hardened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't look at Rachel, didn't say another word to Bryce or Liam, who were still smirking in the background. He simply made a call. And just like that, the night took a turn no one in that restaurant was prepared for. Elijah held the phone to his ear, his expression unreadable. Amira didn't have to ask who he was calling. She already knew. She watched as his fingers tightened slightly around the phone, the only sign that his patience was slipping. Rachel, the hostess, tapped her nails against the podium, clearly waiting for them to leave. She had already dismissed them in her mind, moving on to the next guests who, in her eyes, actually belonged there. Across the room, Bryce and Liam, the two waiters who had laughed earlier, continued their conversation, their voices hushed but still filled with amusement. They weren't even trying to hide their smirks anymore. Elijah's voice was calm when he finally spoke into the phone. "Are you nearby?" A brief pause, then a response on the other end. "Good. Come in through the front." He ended the call without another word, sliding the phone back into his pocket. Amira, who had remained silent, simply glanced at him, her eyes sharp with understanding. Rachel cleared her throat. "If there's nothing else, I have other guests to attend to." Elijah turned his attention back to her. His smile was polite, but his eyes held something colder, something that made Rachel shift slightly where she stood. "We'll wait," he said simply. Rachel's brow furrowed. "For what?" Elijah didn't answer. He simply moved to the side, guiding Amira with him, and leaned casually against the wall near the entrance. Rachel hesitated, glancing toward the dining area, as if expecting someone to step in and remove them. When no one did, she let out a quiet huff and turned her attention back to her reservation list, pretending they no longer existed. Minutes passed. The restaurant continued its usual rhythm, waiters weaving between tables, glasses clinking, conversations flowing. But an unspoken tension settled in the air, subtle but growing. Some of the guests had started to notice, their eyes flicking toward the entrance, sensing something was about to shift. Then the glass doors swung open. A man in a tailored suit stepped inside, his presence commanding in a way that made heads turn. His expression was calm, but his gaze was sharp, scanning the room with quiet authority. Rachel straightened immediately, her professional mask snapping into place. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" The man didn't even glance at her. Instead, his eyes locked onto Elijah and Amira, a knowing look passing between them. "Elijah," he greeted, his voice smooth, respectful. Elijah pushed off the wall, shaking his hand firmly. "Right on time." Rachel's smile faltered. She glanced between them, confusion creeping into her expression. Excuse me, but who are you?" she asked hesitantly. The man finally turned his attention to her, his gaze assessing. "I'm the district manager of this franchise." The color drained from Rachel's face. Silence stretched through the entrance. Bryce and Liam, who had been casually chatting, went rigid. A few of the nearby waiters slowed in their movements, suddenly far more interested in what was happening at the front of the restaurant. Elijah crossed his arms, his expression unreadable, as he watched the realization settle in. Rachel swallowed hard but forced a strained smile. "Oh, of course, I didn't realize." The district manager didn't acknowledge her stumbling words. Instead, he turned back to Elijah. "Something tells me there's a problem here," he said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to silence the surrounding chatter. Elijah let the moment stretch before answering. "You could say that." Rachel took a half step back, suddenly wishing she had paid a little more attention to who she had just turned away. Rachel's fingers twitched slightly against the podium as she struggled to maintain her composure. The district manager's sudden arrival had shifted the energy in the room, and she could feel the weight of every passing second pressing down on her. I, we have a full house tonight," she stammered, her voice losing the sharp confidence it had carried just moments ago. "I wasn't aware that—" Elijah tilted his head slightly, watching her with an unreadable expression. "That what?" Rachel's throat bobbed. "That you were expecting company." Bryce and Liam, the two waiters who had been so amused earlier, had gone completely still. They exchanged a look, the easy arrogance they had carried before replaced with unease. The district manager turned to Elijah. "Walk me through what happened." Elijah didn't rush. He let the silence stretch, let the anticipation build before speaking. "We walked in, asked for a table," he said simply. "We were told there were no tables, no wait list, and no exceptions." The district manager's eyes flickered toward Rachel, who looked as if she wanted to sink into the floor. "Is that right?" Rachel forced a smile, but it barely held. "Well, it's just that we do have a reservation policy, and we try to prioritize regulars." Amira cut in smoothly. Rachel flinched. The district manager's gaze sharpened. I see. And yet I'm looking at several open tables. Rachel's lips parted, but no words came out. Elijah let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. I wasn't going to say anything, he admitted. I was just going to leave. But then your staff decided to make a joke out of it. Rachel's stomach dropped. Bryce and Liam suddenly found the floor very interesting. The district manager's face darkened. A joke? Amira's voice was quiet but firm. We were dismissed, laughed at. A hushed murmur rippled through the restaurant. Some of the diners had begun paying close attention now, their conversations dying down as they watched the scene unfold. Rachel's panic was starting to show. I wasn't aware of that, she said quickly. I would never… Elijah cut her off. But you did. And you weren't just dismissing any customers, Rachel. She swallowed hard. I understand, and I deeply apologize for any misunderstanding. Elijah's smile was cold. Misunderstanding? Rachel nodded too fast. Of course, if I had known who you were. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew she had made a mistake. Elijah's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. Amira arched a brow, her lips pressing together in a way that almost resembled amusement. The district manager exhaled slowly, as if trying to keep his patience. Let me make sure I understand, Elijah said, his voice dangerously calm. If we had been someone important, you would have treated us differently? Rachel opened her mouth, then shut it again. Elijah's silence was heavier than any accusation. He let the weight of her words settle over her like a thick fog, let her realize in real time just how deep she had buried herself. The district manager turned to her. Get the general manager. Rachel hesitated. He's not here tonight. The district manager's jaw tightened. Then get whoever's in charge. Rachel didn't move at first. Then with a quick nod, she turned and disappeared into the back. Her steps hurried. Bryce and Liam, who had remained frozen, took half a step toward the kitchen as well, as if hoping to escape. Elijah's voice stopped them. No, he said simply. You two stay. The restaurant had gone eerily silent. All eyes were on them now, and for the first time since Elijah and Amira had walked through those doors, it was no longer them who were being watched. Bryce and Liam froze in place, their backs stiffening at Elijah's words. The quiet hum of conversation that once filled the restaurant had vanished, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable silence. No one had expected this night to take such a turn, not the staff, not the diners, and certainly not the ones who had laughed just moments ago. The district manager crossed his arms and fixed his gaze on Bryce and Liam. Is there something you'd like to explain? Liam, the younger of the two, swallowed hard, his confidence now cracking under pressure. We didn't mean anything by it, he said, his voice tight. It was just a misunderstanding. Elijah's expression didn't change. Funny how often that word keeps coming up tonight. Amira leaned slightly toward Elijah, her voice quiet but firm. They knew exactly what they were doing. Bryce, who had been silent until now, took a shallow breath, trying to regain control of the situation. He forced a weak smile, the kind that might have worked on someone else. Look, we didn't know who you were. It's just a busy night, and things get mixed up sometimes. Elijah's eyes darkened, his patience wearing thin. He could tolerate ignorance. He could even tolerate arrogance. But what he wouldn't tolerate was someone playing dumb when caught red-handed. So let's say we weren't who we are, Elijah said, his voice low, steady. Let's say we were just another couple, just two people looking for a meal. Would you still be laughing? Would you still be turning us away? Neither of them answered. The district manager sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw, his frustration evident. Do you two even realize what you've just done? Bryce glanced at Liam, who looked like he was hoping for an escape route that didn't exist. I'll tell you, Elijah said before they could speak. You embarrassed this restaurant. You embarrassed the franchise. You embarrassed yourselves. He took a small step forward, his voice growing quieter, sharper. You think a joke and a couple of excuses will fix that? Bryce's jaw tightened, but he didn't dare respond. Before another word could be spoken, Rachel returned, followed closely by Greg, the assistant manager. Unlike Rachel, Greg didn't carry himself with the same rehearsed authority. His shirt was slightly untucked, and there was already sweat forming at his temples. He had been pulled into something much bigger than he was ready for, and he knew it. "What's going on here?" Greg asked, his tone rushed, his gaze darting between Rachel, the district manager, and Elijah. The district manager didn't even look at him. "You're in charge tonight?" Greg hesitated. Yes." "Then you're going to want to listen carefully." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but the weight of the moment stopped him. His eyes finally settled on Elijah and Amira, and confusion flickered across his face. He could tell something was off, that these weren't just any customers. Elijah watched him for a moment before speaking. "Your hostess turned us away. Your waitstaff laughed about it, and when we asked questions, we were lied to." Greg blinked, shifting awkwardly. "I'm sure it was just, don't say a misunderstanding," Amira cut in. Greg closed his mouth. Rachel's eyes darted between them, her breath quickening. She had been hoping Greg would step in, smooth things over, maybe even take the heat for her. But it was clear now. There was no smoothing this over. Elijah gave Greg a long look. "So tell me, assistant manager, what do you plan to do about it?" Greg swallowed hard. The entire restaurant was watching now, and there was no answer that was going to save him. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his fingers gripping the edge of his notepad as if it could somehow anchor him in place. He had been thrown into plenty of difficult situations before, but nothing like this. His usual strategy, smiling through problems and brushing them under the rug, wasn't going to work this time. The weight of every stare in the restaurant pressed against him, but none more than the eyes of the district manager, Elijah, and Amira. The way they looked at him told him there was no easy way out, no fast excuse, no polite apology that would undo what had already been done. Greg cleared his throat. I can comp your meal?" Elijah let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. The response wasn't unexpected, but it was still disappointing. Amira crossed her arms. "A free meal?" she repeated, her voice carrying just enough amusement to make Greg's face burn with embarrassment. Greg hesitated. "Or, a discount?" Silence. The district manager sighed, rubbing his temple as if he had just witnessed the most idiotic move in history. Elijah's voice remained steady. "You think we care about a free meal?" Greg opened his mouth and shut it again. "Let me explain something to you," Elijah continued. "We can buy this entire restaurant. We can buy this location and every other location under this franchise. And do you think the first thing we'd do is sit down for a free steak?" Greg paled. His mind was struggling to catch up, to piece together what he had just heard. I don't understand." Rachel took a small step back. Bryce and Liam barely breathed. The district manager, who had been watching the scene unfold, finally spoke up. "You should understand, Greg, because you're about to realize exactly how bad of a mistake this is." Elijah turned toward Amira and gave her a small nod. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a sleek black folder, and handed it to the district manager. Without a word, the district manager flipped it open, pulled out a few sheets of paper, and laid them flat on the podium where Rachel had been standing. Rachel, Greg, Bryce, and Liam leaned in slightly, their eyes scanning the document, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The first thing Greg saw was the franchise logo. The next thing he saw was Elijah's name, and beneath it, his title. Silence crushed the air out of the room. Greg blinked, then blinked again. His lips parted, but no sound came out. Rachel's knees felt weak. Her vision blurred for half a second as her brain scrambled to process what was happening. Bryce and Liam? They just looked sick. Elijah finally spoke again, his voice just as calm as before. "Let me introduce myself properly," he said. "I own this franchise, every location in this city, and quite a few beyond that." He turned toward Amira, who was watching with quiet satisfaction. "And my wife is the co-owner." Rachel's breath hitched. Greg's face drained of all color. Bryce and Liam went stiff as stone. Elijah took his time, letting the weight of his words sink in. Then after a beat, he spoke again, voice steady. "So now that we all fully understand who we are, let's try this again." His gaze sharpened as he looked Greg straight in the eye. What are you going to do about it? Greg swallowed hard, his hands gripping the sides of the podium, as if the ground itself had started to shift beneath him. Because in that moment, it had. Greg stood frozen, his mind racing but coming up empty. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just an awkward situation that could be patched up with a half-hearted apology and a complimentary dessert. This was career-ending. His throat was dry. He looked at the district manager, hoping for some kind of guidance, some kind of out. But there was nothing there, just silent disappointment. Rachel had gone stiff, her hands gripping the podium as if it could hold her together. The confidence she had worn so easily before had completely drained from her face. Bryce and Liam, they looked like men who had already been buried, standing in their own graves before the first shovel of dirt had even been thrown. Elijah didn't move, didn't rush. He just waited, giving Greg the chance to dig himself into an even deeper hole if he wanted to. Greg cleared his throat, forcing himself to find his voice. I had no idea, he stammered. Elijah tilted his head slightly. No idea about what? Greg swallowed. That you own the franchise. A humorless chuckle escaped from Amira, her arms still crossed as she watched him flounder. So if we weren't the owners, this would have been okay? Greg's stomach turned to ice. No, of course not, he blurted, shaking his head. That's not what I meant. Elijah's gaze remained steady. Then explain. Greg hesitated, but what could he possibly say? There was no explanation, none that would excuse what had happened. I take full responsibility, he said quickly, his words rushing out in a desperate attempt to control the situation. This was unacceptable, and I sincerely apologize. Apologize for what exactly? Amira asked, her voice deceptively light. Greg flinched. For the poor service. Amira raised a brow. Poor service? The district manager exhaled, shaking his head as he leaned against the podium. Greg, stop talking. Greg's mouth snapped shut, his pulse hammering in his ears. Elijah took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to send a clear message. You didn't just provide poor service, he said. You didn't forget to refill a glass of water. You didn't mess up an order. You and your staff chose to treat us differently. Rachel's breath hitched, but she said nothing. Elijah's voice remained steady. You assumed, the second we walked in, that we weren't the kind of people who belonged here. And when we questioned it, you dismissed us. When we pointed out the open tables, you lied. And when we left, your staff laughed about it. Silence. Elijah let it stretch, let them feel it. This isn't about a mistake, he continued. This is about the fact that the people in this restaurant, the ones who represent our business, think they get to decide who deserves to be treated with respect and who doesn't. Greg's fingers twitched. He looked around, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. I don't tolerate discrimination in my restaurant, he tried weakly. Elijah's expression didn't change. It's not your restaurant. Greg's breath stuttered. Elijah continued, his tone measured. And that's the real problem, isn't it? You thought you were in charge. You thought you had power. You thought that when we walked in, we had to earn your approval. But it turns out, Greg, Elijah's voice dropped slightly, cutting through the air like a blade. You work for us. Greg flinched, his entire body stiffening. Rachel inhaled sharply. Bryce and Liam, they were barely breathing. The weight of reality crashed down on them all at once. Greg finally understood. He never had the power. Elijah let the truth sink in before speaking again. So let me ask you one last time. What are you going to do about it? Greg hesitated, his lips parting. But this time, nothing came out. The district manager finally pushed off the podium, shaking his head. I'll tell you what's going to happen, he said. Rachel, you're fired, effective immediately. Rachel let out a soft gasp, her eyes widening. Wait. The district manager ignored her, already turning to Greg. And you? You're done too. If the general manager were here, he'd be clearing out your office as we speak. Greg's face went pale, his body locked in place. I can fix this. No, Elijah said, cutting him off. You can't. The district manager turned to Bryce and Liam. As for you two, you better hope corporate doesn't get a full report on this. But as of now, you're both on indefinite suspension. If I were you, I'd start looking for another job." Bryce's jaw tensed and Liam's head hung low. Rachel finally snapped out of her stunned silence. "This is unfair," she blurted. "I was just doing my job." Amira turned toward her with a look so sharp that it stopped Rachel mid-sentence. "You're right," Amira said. "You were doing your job, and that is exactly why you're being fired." Rachel's lips parted, but there was nothing left to say. The district manager let out a sigh, rubbing his temples. "This is not how we run our business, and it's definitely not what we built this franchise for." He turned toward Elijah and Amira, his expression apologetic. "I'll be sending a full report to corporate first thing in the morning, and we'll be making sure nothing like this ever happens again." Elijah studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good." The district manager hesitated. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" "On the house, of course." Elijah and Amira exchanged a glance. Then Amira let out a soft laugh. "We just fired half your staff. Do you really think we trust what's coming out of your kitchen tonight?" The district manager blinked, then let out a quiet chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fair enough." Elijah slipped his hands into his pockets and took one last glance around the restaurant. The tables were still filled with guests, some whispering, some pretending not to listen. But everyone had seen what just happened, and they would remember. Without another word, Elijah and Amira turned and walked out. The restaurant doors swung shut behind them, and inside the ones left behind stood in the wreckage of their own making. The air outside felt different, lighter somehow, as Elijah and Amira stepped onto the pavement. The restaurant's warm glow still illuminated the sidewalk, but inside the mood had shifted entirely. The weight of what had just happened lingered behind them like an invisible storm, leaving the people inside scrambling to make sense of their new reality. Elijah glanced at his watch, his expression calm, unreadable. 26 minutes, he murmured. Amira raised a brow. "That's how long it took?" He nodded. "From the moment we walked in to the moment we walked out." Amira let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "That might be a new record." A sleek black car pulled up in front of them, the headlights casting long shadows against the pavement. The driver stepped out immediately, moving to open the door for them. But before Elijah could slide inside, he paused, his gaze flickering back toward the restaurant. Through the glass windows, he could still see the aftermath. Greg stood stiffly near the podium, his hands braced against it as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. His lips moved quickly, probably trying to reason with the district manager, to plead, to save himself from the disaster he had just walked into. But it was clear from the district manager's posture that the decision had already been made. Rachel had stepped away, her expression tight, her face pale. She wasn't arguing, wasn't even trying to fight back anymore. She knew she had lost. Bryce and Liam, the waiters who had smirked and whispered, now looked like ghosts of themselves, standing in stunned silence. Elijah tilted his head slightly, observing them, letting the weight of his gaze settle even through the distance. The same people who had laughed at them just 20 minutes ago now stood drenched in humiliation, exposed in the harshest way possible. Amira followed his gaze, her arms folding. "They thought they were untouchable," she murmured. Elijah exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening just slightly. "They always do." They stood there for a few more seconds, watching. Not because they needed to. This wasn't about gloating, about basking in the downfall of the people who had underestimated them. It was about something much bigger than that. It was about reminder. For years, they had built their empire from the ground up, fighting against expectations, against assumptions, against the quiet barriers that were placed in their way, invisible to those who never had to climb over them. And still, no matter how much success they achieved, no matter how many businesses they owned, how much wealth they had, there were always people like Greg, like Rachel, like Bryce and Liam, people who believed they had the right to decide who was worthy of respect. And the only way to change that, make them remember, not just tonight, not just tomorrow, but every single time they stepped into that restaurant, every time they put on their uniforms, every time they looked at another customer who didn't fit into their narrow-minded definition of belonging, they would remember, because people like Elijah and Amira didn't just walk away quietly. They changed the rules. Elijah finally turned toward the car, exhaling through his nose as he stepped inside. Amira slid in beside him, the door shutting softly behind them. The driver adjusted his seat and glanced in the rearview mirror. "Where to, sir?" Elijah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for Amira's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. She squeezed gently, tilting her head toward him, her expression warm despite everything. "Home," Elijah said finally. The car pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly down the street, leaving the restaurant and everything inside it behind. But inside, the ones they left standing in the wreckage, they wouldn't forget. Not tonight. Not ever. The drive home was quiet. Not the kind of silence that felt awkward or heavy, but the kind that followed a moment of absolute clarity. Elijah and Amira sat side by side in the back seat, the city lights flickering past them, reflections of a world that was still moving, still unaware of what had just unraveled inside that restaurant. Elijah kept one hand resting on his knee, the other still laced with Amira's. His thumb brushed over her knuckles absent-mindedly, a habit he had developed over the years, a small, silent reassurance. Amira glanced at him, watching the way his jaw tensed slightly, his eyes fixed on the passing streets. She had known him long enough to recognize that his mind was still turning, still replaying the night in slow motion. "You're thinking about it," she murmured. Elijah exhaled, turning his head just enough to meet her gaze. "Aren't you?" She didn't deny it. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying him. "It's not over, is it?" He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Not even close." Amira sighed, leaning back against the seat. "It never is." That was the truth, wasn't it? It was never just about one incident. It was never just about one restaurant, one moment of disrespect. This kind of thing happened in 1,000 different ways, in 1,000 different places, and no matter how much power, how much success, how much influence they built, they would always find themselves back in the same fight. Elijah looked down at their intertwined hands. "Do you ever get tired?" Amira arched a brow, a small smirk tugging at her lips. "Of you?" "Every day." Elijah huffed out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. She softened. "But of this?" "Number." He met her eyes again, searching. "Because the moment we get tired," she continued, "is the moment people like them win." Elijah let her words settle, rolling them over in his mind. She was right. He knew she was right. But still, there was something about tonight that had lingered longer than usual. "They didn't even hesitate," he said after a beat. "Rachel, Greg, the others. The second they saw us, they made their decision. No second thoughts. No doubts." Amira's gaze darkened slightly. "Because it's easy for them," she murmured. "It's second nature. They don't even have to think about it. It's just the way they move through the world." Elijah exhaled slowly. "That's what gets me the most. That this wasn't personal to them." He paused, shaking his head slightly. "But it was to us." Amira tightened her grip on his hand. "It always is." The car slowed as they approached their home, a sleek, modern estate tucked behind tall gates, its design a testament to everything they had built, everything they had fought for. The driver pulled up to the entrance, stepping out to open the door. Amira slid out first, stretching her arms slightly before adjusting the strap of her purse. Elijah followed, rolling his shoulders as he took a slow breath of the cool night air. The driver hesitated. "Would you like me to bring in your things?" Elijah shook his head. "No, that's all for tonight." The driver gave a small nod, stepping back toward the car. Elijah and Amira made their way inside, the quiet hum of their home wrapping around them like a familiar warmth. The soft lighting illuminated the polished wood floors, the minimalist furniture, the subtle touches of personality that made the space theirs. But even as they stepped into their sanctuary, the weight of the evening still lingered. Amira kicked off her heels, running a hand through her hair as she turned toward him. "You're still thinking about it." Elijah loosened his tie, tossing it onto the counter. "I'm thinking about what comes next." Amira gave him a look, one that was both knowing and amused. "I know that look," she teased. "That's your, I'm about to shake the whole system face." Elijah smirked. "Maybe." Amira crossed her arms, watching him. "Talk to me." He exhaled, leaning against the counter. Firing Greg and Rachel, that's a start, but it's not enough. Amira tilted her head. You want to do more? Elijah nodded. I want to set a standard, not just for that restaurant, but for all of them. Amira watched him, waiting. I want mandatory training for every single employee under this franchise, he continued. Top to bottom, not just some corporate diversity seminar that gets ignored. Real training. Real accountability. Amira's lips parted slightly, intrigued. Elijah pushed off the counter. I want cameras at every entrance, monitored for discrimination cases. I want undercover audits, real ones, where no one knows they're being watched. And if any location fails to meet the new standards? He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. They're done. No warnings, no second chances. Amira's eyes lit up slightly, a slow smile tugging at the corner of her lips. So you don't just want to fix one restaurant? Elijah shook his head. I want to fix the whole damn system. Amira let out a soft chuckle, stepping closer. You always think big, Elijah smirked. It's the only way to think. She reached up, smoothing her hands over his shoulders, letting them rest there for a moment. You realize what this means, don't you? He raised a brow. What? She leaned in, lowering her voice slightly. You're about to make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Elijah chuckled, his grip tightening around her waist. Good. Because if there was one thing he had learned over the years, it was that change never happened when people were comfortable. And after tonight, a lot of people were about to get very, very uncomfortable. The weight of Elijah's words settled between them like an unspoken promise. Amira studied his face, seeing the gears turning in his mind, the way they always did when he was about to shift from reacting to taking action. She sighed, shaking her head with a smirk. You really don't know how to let things go, do you? Elijah met her gaze, his expression calm but determined. Why should I? Amira didn't answer because deep down, she felt the same way. She stepped back, moving toward the living room, where the city skyline stretched across the floor-to-ceiling windows. Their home was a symbol of everything they had worked for. The late nights, the sacrifices, the constant uphill battles. It was proof that they had built something permanent, something no one could take from them. And yet, no matter how much success they had, moments like tonight reminded them that the fight was never really over. Elijah moved to the bar cart in the corner, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. We'll need to make some calls first thing in the morning, he said. Amira arched a brow. You're starting this tomorrow? Elijah took a sip, nodding. Why wait? Amira let out a soft laugh, sinking onto the couch. You do realize most people would have just taken their meal somewhere else, right? Elijah smirked. Most people aren't us. That was the difference. Most people would have swallowed the disrespect, let it roll off their shoulders and moved on. Most people would have avoided the confrontation, chalked it up as just another example of how things were. But Elijah and Amira had never been most people. Amira leaned back, her gaze fixed on the ceiling for a moment. Who's first on your call list? Elijah set his glass down. Corporate. I want this policy in writing. I want it rolled out to every location. Amira nodded, already thinking ahead. We'll need to bring in someone to oversee the training. Someone we trust. Elijah smirked. I was thinking you. Amira laughed, shaking her head. You really know how to put me to work, huh? Elijah grinned. You're the best at what you do, and you love making people sweat. She tilted her head, considering. True. Her mind was already forming the structure, how the program would work, how they would enforce it, how they would make sure no one could ever claim ignorance again. Elijah watched her, knowing that she was already 10 steps ahead, the way she always was. After a moment, Amira turned back to him. You know they're going to push back, Elijah nodded. Let them. She studied him for a second. It's not just going to be the employees, the franchise board, the investors. Some of them are going to hate this. Elijah didn't flinch. Then they can take their money somewhere else. Amira let out a soft breath, shaking her head. You really are something else. Elijah shrugged, sipping his whiskey. I just don't believe in half measures. That was what made him different. He didn't just want to fix the problem in one restaurant. He wanted to burn the whole system down and rebuild it from the ground up. And if that meant losing people along the way, so be it. Amira reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts. "All right," she said. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. I'll call my legal team in the morning. If we're enforcing these policies, we're going to need airtight contracts." Elijah smirked. "You read my mind." Amira let out a dramatic sigh. "Of course I did. I've been married to you for too long." Elijah chuckled, walking over and pressing a kiss to her temple. "And yet you still haven't run for the hills." She smirked. "Too late for that now." They both fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of their decisions settling in. Tomorrow things would start changing. Some people wouldn't like it. Some would fight against it. But by the time they were done, no one working under their name would ever forget what happened tonight. And that was exactly the point. The morning arrived faster than expected, bringing with it a new kind of energy. The kind that came with knowing change was about to happen. The kind that made people uncomfortable. Not just the ones responsible for last night's disaster, but the ones who had been coasting, believing they could keep their heads down and let the system protect them. Elijah was already dressed by the time Amira walked into the kitchen, her silk robe loosely tied around her waist, her hair still slightly tousled from sleep. But she was awake, alert, and judging by the way she scrolled through her phone with a look of quiet determination, she was already 5 steps ahead of him. Elijah poured her a cup of coffee, sliding it across the marble counter toward her. "How bad is it?" Amira took a sip before answering. "The restaurant incident is spreading." Elijah lifted a brow. "Already?" Amira smirked. "You think a place like that humiliating people like us would go unnoticed?" She turned the phone toward him, showing a viral thread on social media. Someone had been in the restaurant last night, filming parts of the exchange. The caption read, "Man shuts down racist restaurant in real time." Staff didn't know who they were messing with. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "The internet moves fast." Amira scrolled further. "Faster than corporate. We're already getting calls." Elijah took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the moment sink in. "Good." She leaned against the counter, tilting her head. "You really aren't going to give them a chance to recover, are you?" Elijah set his mug down. "Why should I?" Amira laughed, shaking her head. "You're ruthless." He smirked. "I prefer efficient." The first call of the day came in at exactly 8 a.m. Daniel Carter, the senior executive at the franchise's corporate office, didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Elijah," Daniel sighed, his voice tight. "I assume you've seen what's happening online?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, glancing at Amira, who was listening with a smirk. "I have." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You couldn't have called before this blew up?" Elijah chuckled. "I did call. I called my district manager. And then I let the truth handle the rest." Daniel hesitated. "Look, this is a PR nightmare. We're already getting backlash, and we're still sorting through what happened. Can we at least agree to handle this internally before more damage is done?" Elijah's voice remained calm. "That depends. What's your definition of handling it?" Daniel's silence stretched for a beat too long. Elijah smirked. "That's what I thought." "Elijah," Daniel started, "you have to understand these kinds of situations are sensitive. If we overcorrect, we risk alienating a lot of people." "Eliminating racists from our franchise alienates people?" Elijah cut in, his voice sharper now. Daniel backpedaled quickly. "That's not what I meant. I just mean that we need to be strategic. If we fire too many people at once, we create staffing issues, which could affect business." Elijah exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Daniel, do you know how stupid you sound right now?" Silence. Elijah continued, his voice steady. "If you're more worried about replacing bad employees than you are about who is representing this brand, then you're exactly the problem." Daniel scrambled for a response. "That's not—" "Elijah, this is bigger than one restaurant." Elijah smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "You're damn right it is." Amira crossed her arms, watching the way Elijah's body language shifted. She had seen this before. The moment where he stopped treating people like business partners and started treating them like obstacles. Elijah leaned forward slightly. "Here's how this is going to work, Daniel. I'm implementing mandatory anti-discrimination training across every single location under my name." Daniel let out a quiet sigh. "Elijah, these programs take time." "Then I suggest you start moving now." "Elijah, I'm not done." Daniel shut up. Amira bit back a smirk, sipping her coffee. Elijah continued. Any franchisee who refuses the new policies? Gone. Their contract gets terminated. Any manager caught treating customers differently based on race, class, or whatever nonsense they believe they have the right to enforce? Fired. No second chances. Elijah, it's non-negotiable. Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then finally, in a tone that was a little too cautious, he said, "The board won't be happy." Elijah chuckled. "The board works for me." Daniel exhaled. "You really aren't giving me much choice here, are you?" Elijah's smile was sharp. "Now you're getting it." Another long pause. Then finally Daniel relented. "Fine. I'll start drafting the policy updates." "Good." Elijah leaned back in his chair. "Send them to my office by noon." Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "Noon? You're serious." "Dead serious." Daniel sighed. "All right. I'll make it happen." The call ended. Amira tilted her head, watching Elijah with quiet amusement. "You really don't let up, do you?" Elijah smirked. "Nope." She chuckled, shaking her head. "You realize what you just did, right?" Elijah set his phone down. "Yeah." She leaned against the counter. "You just changed the rules for everyone." Elijah met her gaze, his expression calm, unwavering. That was the point. Because this was never just about one bad restaurant, one racist hostess, one smug assistant manager. This was about control. Who had it? Who thought they had it? And who just realized they never had it at all? Elijah stood up, stretching slightly before rolling his shoulders back. "Now," he said, glancing at Amira, "let's see how many more people wake up uncomfortable today." Amira smirked. "Let's." And just like that, the next battle had already begun. By noon, the emails had started rolling in. Corporate executives scrambling to adjust policies, legal teams reviewing contracts, and franchise owners calling in. Some panicked, some angry, but all very aware that the game had changed overnight. Elijah sat in his home office, a large modern space lined with sleek bookshelves and a massive desk where his laptop screen was filled with unread messages. He scrolled through them, his expression neutral, but the smirk on his lips growing with every panicked email. Subject: urgent policy revisions. Elijah, we need to discuss these new requirements before implementing anything company-wide. Some locations are concerned about the costs and employee retention. Subject: concern regarding franchise compliance. We understand the importance of diversity initiatives, but immediate terminations could create legal issues. Can we slow this process down? Subject: immediate franchise response requested. Elijah, we need to talk. Some of our top-performing locations are pushing back against this training. They're saying it's unnecessary and could impact the customer experience. Elijah let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. It was always the same pattern. The second people were held accountable, they started finding excuses. Across the room, Amira sat in the lounge chair by the window, scrolling through her own phone. She glanced up, watching his expression. "They're panicking, aren't they?" Elijah nodded. "Like clockwork." She smirked. "Who's the most upset?" Elijah clicked open another email. Apparently, a few of the high-earning locations think sensitivity training will make their staff soft. Amira let out an amused huff. "Soft? What, they think treating people with basic respect is weakness?" Elijah shrugged. "Apparently, they think discrimination is good for business," Amira scoffed. "And that is exactly why we're doing this." Elijah leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "They don't see it yet. They think they're untouchable, that we won't actually follow through." Amira studied him. "So what's the plan?" Elijah smirked. "We make an example out of someone." Before Amira could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A familiar number. Jackson Mitchell, franchise investor. Elijah's smirk widened. "Here we go," he answered, placing the call on speaker. "Jackson?" "Elijah," Jackson's voice came through, deep and lined with thinly veiled frustration. "I just got off a call with the board. What the hell is going on?" Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "What exactly are you referring to?" Jackson let out a sharp breath. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. I've got half a dozen franchise owners blowing up my phone saying you're forcing them into new policies overnight. No discussions, no adjustments, just a mandate. Elijah nodded. Correct. Jackson's irritation spiked. Elijah, this is not how we run things. You can't just dictate company-wide policies without consulting key stakeholders. These people have invested millions into their locations. Elijah remained calm. And you think that gives them the right to discriminate? That's not what I'm saying, Jackson snapped. But policies like this have consequences. If we start firing managers left and right, who's going to replace them? If we make sensitivity training mandatory, how do we control the narrative? We have to be careful about how we implement this. Elijah's jaw clenched. Careful? Jackson sighed. Look, I get what happened at that restaurant was bad, but was it really worth blowing up the entire system? Elijah's voice dropped a degree. What happened at that restaurant wasn't an accident. It wasn't one bad night. It was the result of the system you're so desperate to protect. Jackson exhaled heavily. You're making this personal. Elijah let out a cold laugh. It is personal. You think this is just about Amira and me? You think we're the only ones this has happened to? Jackson hesitated. Elijah continued, his tone sharper now. This happens every single day in places just like ours. And as long as people like Rachel and Greg know they can get away with it, they'll keep doing it. That stops now. Jackson's voice lowered. Elijah, listen to me. If you push this too hard, you're going to lose people. Elijah's smirk returned. Good. Let them go. Jackson let out a frustrated noise. You don't mean that. Elijah's voice was absolute. I do. The silence stretched. Then Jackson's tone shifted, trying a different angle. You're forgetting something, Elijah. These franchise owners, they have power. They can pull their contracts. They can take their money somewhere else. You push too hard, and you'll be the one suffering losses. Amira's eyes flickered with interest, watching how Elijah would respond. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. Jackson, you're the one forgetting something. Jackson hesitated. Elijah leaned forward. I don't answer to them. They answered to me. Silence. Elijah continued. They sign my contracts. They run my restaurants. The only reason they have a business is because I allow them to. Jackson was quiet. Elijah's voice remained steady. So if any of them want to walk, let them. I'll personally make sure they regret it. Jackson exhaled slowly. Elijah, I'm telling you, this is a dangerous move. Elijah's expression darkened. The only thing dangerous is letting this continue, and that is what I refuse to do. Jackson hesitated, then sighed. So that's it? You're really going through with this? Elijah didn't waver. We start the terminations tomorrow. Any owner who refuses the policies is next. If they want to run a business under my name, they do it my way. Jackson let out another breath. Lower this time. Damn it, Elijah, Elijah smirked. You have until midnight to let them know. Before Jackson could say anything else, Elijah ended the call. Amira exhaled, shaking her head with a small laugh. Well, you just started a war. Elijah leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. No, his smirk deepened. I just finished it. Amira chuckled, standing up from her chair. Now that was fun to watch. Elijah exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Now we wait. Amira tilted her head. How long before the next meltdown? Elijah glanced at his phone. Give it an hour. She laughed, heading toward the kitchen. I'm making popcorn. This is going to be good. Elijah smiled, leaning back as the notifications continued flooding his screen. Because after today, everyone who thought they could keep playing the same game, who thought power was something they could hoard for themselves, who thought people like him didn't belong in their spaces, they were about to learn a very, very painful lesson. The next 24 hours were nothing short of chaos. Emails poured in. Calls came in back to back. Legal teams scrambled to rewrite contracts, while franchise owners, many of whom had never even spoken to Elijah directly, were suddenly desperate to get him on the phone. Some tried to reason with him. Some tried to negotiate. A few were outright furious, demanding to know how he could make such sweeping changes without consulting them. Elijah ignored most of them. He had already made his decision. Now it was up to them to decide whether they wanted to stay in business or walk away. By mid-afternoon, corporate had sent out an official memo. New policy enforcement effective immediately. Failure to comply will result in contract termination. Simple. Director, non-negotiable. Elijah sat in his office, his laptop open in front of him, watching as the responses rolled in. Amira sat across from him, one leg tucked under the other, sipping on her tea as she scrolled through social media. "They're losing their minds," she mused, a small smirk playing on her lips. Elijah barely glanced up. "Who?" "The usual crowd," Amira said, tilting her phone toward him. "Franchise owners, concerned customers, a couple of internet personalities who suddenly care a lot about free speech in the workplace." Elijah smirked, shaking his head. "Let me guess. They're claiming we're ruining the company?" "More or less," Amira said. "One guy said you're turning the franchise into a woke disaster. Another said you're alienating real customers." Elijah chuckled, stretching his arms. "Real customers, huh? I'd love to see what he looks like." Amira laughed, setting her phone down. "It's always the same crowd, always the same arguments. You'd think they'd come up with something new." "They don't have to," Elijah said simply, "because for them, the system always worked." He exhaled, glancing at his screen. "They're just mad they finally lost control." Amira studied him, her smirk fading slightly. "Are you ready for what's coming next?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, considering. He had expected backlash. He had expected pushback from the people who had benefited from things staying exactly the way they were. What he hadn't expected, at least not so soon, was how quickly people were choosing sides. Some franchise owners had already agreed to the new policies, sending in confirmations before the ink had even dried. Others were holding out, waiting to see what would happen next. And then there were the ones digging in their heels, sending thinly veiled threats, talking about lawsuits, trying to rally other owners against him. That was the group he was watching closely. "They'll try to fight this," Elijah said, drumming his fingers against his desk. "Some of them will back down once they realize I'm serious. Others," he exhaled, "they'll try to take me down with them." Amira tilted her head. "You worried?" Elijah met her gaze, a slow smirk pulling at his lips. "Not even a little." Amira chuckled, shaking her head. "I knew you were going to say that." Elijah pushed back from his desk, standing up. "If they want to fight, I'll give them one. But they won't like how it ends." Amira's smirk returned. "They never do." Just as Elijah was about to respond, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't another panicked franchise owner or an investor trying to get him to slow down. It was the CEO of the entire franchise corporation. Elijah's brows lifted slightly. "Well, that didn't take long." Amira straightened. "You think he's calling to back you up?" Elijah let out a short laugh. "Number he's calling because the board is freaking out." Amira folded her arms. "So what are you going to do?" Elijah smirked. "Answer." He hit the button, putting the call on speaker. "Elijah," came the smooth, measured voice of Richard Hale, the CEO himself. "I was hoping we could have a conversation." Elijah leaned against his desk. "We're having one now." Richard let out a low chuckle. "I suppose we are." There was a pause. Then carefully, Richard said, "I've been reviewing the policy changes you implemented. It's an aggressive move." Elijah didn't react. "Is it?" Richard exhaled. "You don't think so?" Elijah shrugged, even though the man couldn't see him. "I think it's long overdue." Richard hesitated. "You understand that a policy shift like this impacts not just your locations, but the entire brand." Elijah's voice was calm. "Good." Another pause. "Elijah," Richard said carefully, "you know I respect what you've built. I know why you're doing this. And let me be clear, I don't disagree with you." Elijah exchanged a glance with Amira. "But," Elijah prompted. Richard sighed. "But the board is concerned. If we move too fast, we could lose franchisees. Investors are already nervous. Some are talking about pulling out." Elijah let out a slow breath. "And?" Richard hesitated. "And I need to know how far you're planning to take this." Elijah didn't even blink. "All the way," Richard was silent for a long moment. Then quietly he said, "You're not going to back down on this, are you?" Elijah smirked. "Not even a little." Richard let out another breath. "I had a feeling you'd say that." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "Are you going to try to stop me?" Another beat of silence. Then Richard chuckled. "Number. But I'm going to have to do a hell of a lot of damage control." Elijah smiled. "That's your job, isn't it?" Richard laughed. "Damn it, Elijah." Elijah's smirk didn't fade. "Send out the official statement, Richard. Make it clear that this isn't a suggestion. Anyone who doesn't like it is free to walk." Richard sighed, but there was a hint of something else in his voice. Respect. "I'll draft it now." The call ended. Amira let out a low whistle. "Well, that's that." Elijah nodded, stretching slightly. "One more domino down." She studied him for a moment. "You really just forced the entire company to change overnight." Elijah smirked. "It was never about forcing them." Amira arched a brow. "No?" Elijah's eyes darkened slightly, his smirk deepening. "They just needed to be reminded who was really in charge." Amira laughed, shaking her head as she stood up. "You are so dangerous." Elijah grinned. "And yet, you love me." She rolled her eyes playfully. For now, they both chuckled, but beneath the humor, they knew the fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. The official company-wide statement went out by evening. The email hit every franchise owner, every general manager, every district supervisor. It wasn't a negotiation, it wasn't a request, it was a directive. Effective immediately, all franchise locations under our brand must comply with the new anti-discrimination policies. This includes mandatory training, new hiring standards, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior by employees or management. Failure to comply will result in immediate contract termination. No vague language, no corporate doublespeak, no loopholes. And just like that, the lines were drawn. Elijah leaned back in his chair, watching as the response unfolded in real time. His inbox was exploding. Some franchise owners had already accepted the new policies without hesitation. Others, they were scrambling, complaining, threatening to take their business elsewhere. The problem? It wasn't their business, it was his. Across the room, Amira was still on her laptop, reading through the flood of reactions. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You'd think you just declared martial law with how these people are acting." Elijah smirked. "Let me guess, some of them are outraged?" Amira nodded. "A few are saying it's an overreach. Some are calling it unrealistic. Oh, and one guy said it was authoritarian." Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. "Authoritarian?" Amira turned the screen toward him. "Apparently, treating people with basic respect is now tyranny." Elijah sighed. "The entitlement is almost impressive." Amira scrolled further. "Looks like a few locations are threatening to sue." Elijah didn't even blink. "Let them." Amira raised a brow. "You're not worried?" Elijah leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "Amira, they signed my contracts. Every location operates under our brand. That means they agreed to our rules. And if they don't like it, they're free to leave." Amira smirked. "Which they won't do, because they make too much money under your name." Elijah's eyes glinted. "Exactly. That was the thing people like them never understood. They wanted the brand, the reputation, the prestige that came with running one of his locations. But they didn't want the accountability. That wasn't how this worked." His phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Kenneth Yates, one of the wealthiest franchise owners in the company. "Elijah, we need to talk. Some of us aren't happy with these changes. We should discuss a more reasonable compromise." Elijah snorted. "Here we go." Amira glanced over. "Yates?" Elijah nodded. "He's one of the biggest players, owns 5 locations, brings in millions every quarter." He tapped his phone. "And now he's nervous." Amira smirked. "Because he knows you're not bluffing." Elijah stood up, stretching. "Let's see what he has to say." He dialed the number. After 2 rings, Yates answered. "Elijah," Yates greeted, his tone smooth, practiced. The kind of voice that had spent decades in boardrooms, always negotiating, always angling for leverage. "Yates," Elijah replied casually. "I got your message." Yates didn't waste time. Look, I know what you're trying to do. I get it. And let me be clear, I don't disagree with the sentiment. Elijah smirked. Uh-huh. But, Yates continued, this is moving too fast. Policies like this need time. You can't just push something like this overnight and expect everyone to comply. Elijah leaned against his desk. Why not? Yates hesitated, just for a second. Because you're putting franchise owners in an impossible position. You're asking us to fire managers, retrain staff, overhaul our entire operations. I'm asking you to treat people with basic respect, Elijah corrected. Yates sighed. It's not that simple. Elijah's tone darkened. It is that simple. Another pause. Yates lowered his voice, shifting tactics. Elijah, you and I both know how business works. If you push too hard, you'll make enemies. People with real influence, investors, board members, people who don't like sudden, forced change. You're playing with fire. Elijah chuckled, shaking his head. No, Yates, you are the one playing with fire. Yates didn't respond. Elijah continued. You called me to negotiate, to slow this down, to compromise. He let the word hang in the air. But here's the thing. This isn't a negotiation. Elijah, you either comply, Elijah said simply, or you're out. Yates's voice tightened. You can't afford to lose us. Elijah smiled. Watch me. Silence. A beat passed. Then Yates let out a slow, controlled breath. You really think you can do this without us? Elijah leaned in slightly, his voice calm, unwavering. I know I can. Yates hesitated. There are a lot of us, Elijah. Elijah's smirk deepened. And there are a lot of people waiting to take your place. That was the real truth, wasn't it? For every arrogant franchise owner who thought they were untouchable, there were 10 ambitious entrepreneurs waiting for a shot. Yates knew it too, which was why, after a long silence, his voice finally dropped into something more measured. What if I agree? Elijah shrugged. Then you stay in business. Yates exhaled. And if I don't? Elijah's voice was absolute. Then start packing. Another long pause. Then finally Yates let out a low chuckle. Damn, Elijah smiled. Midnight deadline. Your choice. The call ended. Elijah turned back toward Amira, who had been watching with open amusement. Well, she asked. Elijah rolled his shoulders. He'll cave, Amira smirked. And the others? Elijah's eyes gleamed. They'll fall in line. Because that was the thing about power. It didn't belong to the ones who clung to the past. It didn't belong to the ones who thought they could buy their way out of accountability. Power belonged to the ones who weren't afraid to change the game. And by the time this was over, the ones who had built their success on exclusion, on quiet discrimination, on rules that had never been spoken but always enforced, they were about to find out what happened when those rules got rewritten, by the very people they had once tried to shut out. The hours leading up to midnight were filled with tension, anticipation, and a quiet kind of chaos that could only happen when people who had always held power realized they were about to lose it. The messages kept coming in. Franchise owners who had spent years untouched by accountability now scrambling to save their positions. Some caved immediately, sending rushed emails confirming their compliance with the new policies. Others tried to negotiate, still under the illusion that Elijah was playing a game, that they could wait him out until he backed down. But Elijah didn't back down. By 10 p.m., the divide was clear. 80% of franchise owners had officially agreed to the changes. The remaining 20%? They were holding out, thinking they could call his bluff. They were about to learn the hard way that Elijah didn't bluff. He sat in his office, his laptop open, Amira next to him, as they watched the numbers roll in. The final holdouts had 2 hours left. The ones who had already complied were silent, waiting to see if the others would follow or if they would fall. Amira glanced at the clock. You think any of them will push past the deadline? Elijah leaned back, smirking. One or two might try. Amira tilted her head. And when they do? Elijah's voice was smooth, absolute. They'll be out of business by morning. At exactly 11:45 p.m., the last wave of desperate calls came in, the ones who had waited until the last possible second, hoping Elijah would cave first. He didn't take a single call. By 11:59 p.m., the last stragglers sent in their confirmations, knowing they had no other choice. But three franchise owners never responded. They thought they could call his bluff. At 12:01 a.m., their contracts were terminated. The news broke the next morning. Three high-profile franchise owners had lost their businesses overnight. The official statement was blunt, clear, and left no room for speculation. These franchise owners failed to meet the ethical and operational standards required to represent our brand. As a result, their contracts have been terminated. We remain committed to ensuring that every location under our name upholds the values of integrity, inclusivity, and respect. The fallout was immediate. Corporate investors took notice. Some panicked, some withdrew. But the majority? They recognized what Elijah had just done. He hadn't just changed a policy. He had rewritten the power structure of the entire franchise. Employees took notice. The ones who had worked under racist managers, who had been forced to smile through discrimination, who had swallowed injustice just to keep their jobs. They realized something had shifted. For the first time, they weren't the ones who had to be afraid anymore. And the customers? They noticed too. The restaurant that had started it all? It was closed that day, not because Elijah had shut it down, but because no one showed up. Word had spread. People saw what had happened, and for the first time, the customers were holding businesses accountable. By the time it reopened under new management, it wasn't the same place anymore. New staff, new policies, new culture. Elijah and Amira didn't go back. They didn't need to. Because by the time they were done, it was never just about that restaurant. It was about all of them. The ones who had always thought they were untouchable. The ones who had built their success on quiet discrimination. The ones who had spent their entire lives deciding who got to belong and who didn't. They had spent years making people feel small. And now, they had just been reminded what it felt like to be powerless. Elijah sat on the balcony of their home, sipping his coffee as the sun rose over the city. Amira stood beside him, watching as the world moved forward, as if it didn't even realize how much had just changed overnight. She let out a soft chuckle. Well, that was satisfying. Elijah smirked, taking another sip. It was. She studied him. You done? Elijah exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. For now, Amira smirked. Until the next battle? Elijah chuckled. There's always another battle. She leaned down, kissing his temple. Good thing we never lose. Elijah smirked, setting his mug down. No. He turned to her, his eyes sharp, certain. We don't. And with that, they let the world catch up to the new rules. Rules that, for the first time, they had written. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. See you in the next one.